on the agenda this evening? Lisa, if you can confirm that we,
I see no hands raised at this time.
all right, excellent. Thank you very much. I will now open the public hearing on a request for a electric vehicle charging infrastructure code amendment. The purpose of the hearing is to receive evidence regarding the application materials and provide a public forum for all interested parties who wish to comment on this request before the Planning Commission. The procedure for the public hearing will be as follows. First, there'll be a presentation and testimony by city staff, followed by questions from the Planning Commission to staff. In this case, the applicant is the city of Louisville. So after these presentations, members of the public who have joined this meeting by computer or telephone may speak regarding the application. Anyone who would like to speak is asked to use the raise hand function if participating by computer, or *9 if calling in by telephone. Comments may be limited to 3 minutes, but we this evening may also entertain longer discussion. The purpose of public comment is to receive public testimony and not a forum for debate or dialogue. Commenters are encouraged to raise pertinent issues and may ask questions for clarity. However, these questions will not be directly answered during the public comment period. The applicant and staff will then be allowed to make a closing statement. I will then close the public hearing, and no further testimony or other evidence will be received unless the commission decides to reopen the hearing. The Planning Commission will discuss the matter, may approve with conditions, deny, or continue to a future meeting. Public hearings are recorded for the public record. All testimony must be presented after stating your full name and address. And Lisa, if I can ask you for notification, I believe.
Sure. So this application was noticed per municipal code requirements.
And do any Planning Commission members have any disclosures?
Nope. I have an electric car, but I don't think that will get in the way of me making a decision on this, unless someone else thinks otherwise.
No, I think you're in the clear on that one.
Mhm.
Thank you for joining. All right, if we can have the presentation then, please.
Great. All right, can you all see my screen okay?
Yes.
Great. So yeah, thank you for the introduction there, Chair Brown Ice. I'm not sure why it's not starting as a slideshow. Well, last time I couldn't share. Today my PowerPoint, I think, is being a little weird, but we're just going to go with this. Yes, so tonight we're here to consider a Resolution 13 to recommend consideration of an ordinance amending Title 17 to establish requirements for electric vehicle charging infrastructure. So as further described in your staff report, this is part of a much broader sustainability and energy update that primarily is included in Title 15, which is our building code. So the principal action that will be occurring in conjunction with this amendment to Title 17 is adoption with amendments of the 2021 International Energy Efficiency Code. City Council added this to their work plan for this year here in 2021. And so we're kind of knee-deep going through all of this, primarily with our Building Code Board of Appeals, who does consideration for those types of changes. Planning Commission is considering the portion that's within Title 17, and then all of this will be presented to City Council upcoming in October. And so, again, Planning Commission doesn't really have purview over Title 15. However, if any of you have experience or want to make comment on that, we could discuss it briefly tonight, although I'm not extremely in the loop, nor is that my subject area where I have high level of technical knowledge about some of these amendments, but you also are able to provide written comments to us. You can provide those to staff or just provide those directly to City Council. So if you want to participate in more depth in any comments on Title 15, I would encourage that, but we can touch on it briefly if you'd like. And so primarily, again, there's a lot of amendments in Title 15 related to energy efficiency, insulation, electrical systems, things like that. But part of the overall desire of City Council was to establish requirements for electric vehicle charging infrastructure. And so in order to best regulate this, particularly at the PUD level for commercial redevelopment, we have included the standards within Title 17. And that gives, it's where parking regulations live more broadly. So what are parking, minimum parking requirements, things like that, what have you. And so we wanted to be able to capture that through our zoning requirements, in addition to the technical requirements for these are in Title 15. So the, actual electrical capacity and the installation and all of that are embedded in Title 15, but kind of the minimum requirements, as well as the locational standards, things like that, which we'll talk about, are going to be within Title 17. And so that's what the Planning Commission is here to discuss tonight. Generally, I also want to note that these regulations, proposed regulations, would apply to all new development. And then as far as redevelopment goes, this would only occur, so most of our existing commercial infrastructure and development would only trigger installation of EV charging stations if they're doing an addition of 25% or more, which 25% or more new square footage. There's also a provision if they're adding parking to an existing development, kind of then the new parking area is subject to this ordinance as well. So getting into the ordinance a little bit, I want to talk about the purpose and intent, and this statement is included in the ordinance itself. But really, when we draft purpose and intent statements, that's really trying to communicate what we're trying to achieve. And so basically, we're trying to achieve, and so purpose and intent is to facilitate and encourage the use of electric vehicles to expedite the establishment of convenient and cost-effective electric vehicle infrastructure, as well as try and future-proof the building stock. As well as set the minimum requirements. And so really what we're just trying to do is take away barriers for electric vehicle adoption within the city of Louisville over the upcoming years. In addition, it is cheaper, generally much cheaper, to install this type of infrastructure when the site is under construction rather than retrofit later. So I won't go through these definitions, but we do include new definitions kind of for how these terms are used within the code. And then we are, again, kind of in that purpose and intent, I use the term future-proof. And so we are trying to establish kind of 3 different categories of requirements. And so when we'll get into further what this means, but basically, the highest tier, which is basically on day one when a building opens, there would be what we call an EV installed space. And so that would be a dedicated space with a designated space with actual supply equipment. So on day one, any electric vehicle could pull up to a designated space and plug into supply equipment and charge their vehicle. The next tier, so that tier would be required at building permit and would be kind of established through PUD, required at building permit and available on day one. These next 2 tiers, currently as proposed, these are, there's no city required trigger that would require, at this time anyway, that would require a property owner to kind of complete out and add more EV charging stations. Really what we're trying to do is facilitate as EV use increases and as property owners see extra demand, that we've reduced that barrier. And so kind of the second tier is what we're calling EV ready, and that actually results in an outlet with a receptacle that can accommodate kind of a level 2, as well as adequate electrical capacity in the panel or switchboard. And then finally, our EV capable space, that's the third tier, which, again, kind of as EV use increases even further, that provides a dedicated or a designated space with conduit that can accommodate electrical capacity for a level 2 charging station, as well as sufficient electrical capacity within the electrical system that's installed. And so really, collectively, we'll look at all of this through the building permit on day one. So we'll make sure that there are adequate charging stations to meet the first tier, that there are outlets for the second tier, as well as adequate space, and that there is conduit placed on day one for the third tier. And so really, we'll verify all this through the building permit, but only the EV installed kind of gets you there on day one. And so talking a little bit more about how this draft is proposed, and this is really kind of the meat of what we're really interested in. And particularly those of you with, electric vehicles, I think this is where your own personal experience can help inform where these tiers are appropriate. And so first, let's talk about residential uses. And when we say residential uses here, we're talking about a single family unit that has kind of designated and required parking, or a multifamily unit with dedicated parking spaces or garages. So say, for example, a townhome that has an attached garage, that those spaces are clearly designated for that individual unit. And so for those two tiers, I want to clarify why we went with EV ready rather than EV installed. The intent is in many home chargers, sometimes just require an adapter into a 240 volt outlet. And so really on day one, there would be within the garage or within the designated parking space, a 240 volt outlet that is accessible for a parking space. Understanding that some homeowners, they have an adapter for their vehicle. They don't actually need the equipment itself, or that they can supply the equipment. So we're not requiring that the actual, kind of a separate charging unit is installed in a garage, rather that it has the 240 volt outlet and then one additional capable space. So basically, typically every dwelling unit has a requirement for 2 parking spaces. So we're getting one on day one and then the capacity for a second one later. The rest of these are more of our commercial uses. And so what we tried to do when we thought about how to structure this was which type of uses potentially have higher demand for EV charging based on kind of length they're there. So that assuming if a vehicle is there for a longer space, they're more likely to want to connect to an EV charger. And so really our highest tier are our multifamily properties that don't have dedicated parking spaces or garages. So say an apartment building on day one, and same with a hotel. So for these two tiers on day one, 10% of whatever the required parking spaces would have EV charging stations available. We would trigger another 10% for EV ready and another final 15. So collectively, tier one would have 35% of the parking spaces have electric vehicle charging capacity. Tier two are our employment-oriented uses. So the actual ordinance has this, spelled out with more uses. I just did this in a summary for the slide. But basically, these are kind of your, you're arriving in the morning, you're parking there all day. A fair amount of these may have a commute associated with it. So say you have a vehicle with an electric range of say 30 miles, presumably then by the end of the day, you could then return home on all electric power. And so really that's the intent of this tier two. So again, less than the tier one. So we're at 7% on day one and then 10 and 15. Tier three are your more quick trip type sites. So not to say that in this circumstance, I think we're thinking more about employees and potentially those who, really do just like to charge and maybe they, ran a lot of errands and they just need to top off that battery prior to continuing on their journey. But this one has the lowest tier of charging stations at 5%, 10 and 10. And so really from the Planning Commission, we really want to hear from you on this. I think we'll talk in a second here about what other communities are doing, and those vary wildly, but we really want to hear from you if you think if we should be more aggressive in particular. I think this ordinance is fairly aggressive comparing to our neighborhood communities, but if you think we should even go further, and I think we're certainly happy to consider that. And I think staff has gone back and forth on what these right numbers are. So a little background there. So when we compare our nearby communities, I would say more communities don't have requirements than do. And that's assuming I was able to identify that whether or not requirements existed. So Arvada, Boulder, Broomfield, Erie, Lafayette, Superior, and Longmont, I did not identify any requirements for EV charging. Not to say they don't maybe promote it or have incentives or have programs that would result in EV charging, but I did not identify anything in their zoning or building codes that would trigger this. Boulder County. So first, let's talk about the residential. I think most communities that do have requirements are kind of coming in at the same number of our ordinance, which is 1 for each single or 2-family dwelling. And so most of these codes also don't kind of quantify the difference between kind of EV installed and then capable and ready, other than the city of Lakewood. And so I think we're pretty much in line with some of our neighbors that are doing this type of requirement with, kind of 1 on day 1. We've gone a little further in that we're going to have additional capability there. So Boulder County, from a commercial side, Boulder County kind of has a sliding scale, but it's basically roughly 2% of all of their parking spaces will be EV installed. Fort Collins doesn't require any on day 1, but they require 10% kind of at that EV ready, so electrical capacity and outlets. Golden requires 1 electric vehicle for every 15 spaces, plus another 15% at that EV ready. Lakewood has this 3-tiered, so we kind of modeled our ordinance after Lakewood. Lakewood also has this 3-tier system. Their initial day 1 requirement, though, is much lower at 10%, and then they jump a lot higher on tiers 2, kind of on that 2nd and 3rd, so capable and ready. You can see ours, and then again, Longmont and Superior. So we can come back here if this is helpful, if you're talking about that. And then I won't go through all these. I can pull up the ordinance if helpful, but in addition to the minimum requirements, we're also establishing kind of general standards for ADA accessibility, when these can be public and private, kind of location and maintenance standards. And then we're setting the ability of a property owner to collect a service fee. And with that, we're recommending approval of this resolution, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you have.
I have a question, which is looking at moving down from residential to tier 1, it seems like residential is essentially a 100% requirement, and then we drop to 35% for tier 1, even though sort of use-wise, many of these people are probably similarly situated, right? I mean, for the person with the electric car, there's not a huge difference between living in a condo with a garage or living in an apartment with a parking lot. Those seem like similar situations, and I wonder if we need to, I'm not sure whether one comes up or one goes down, but it seems to me like they should be treated similarly.
I think that's a very fair point. You're right. There's a big discrepancy in kind of the expectation and standards related to kind of your single family dedicated space and say your apartment building. So yeah, certainly interested in hearing your thoughts on that collectively as a group.
And then my other question was, I don't assume this includes e-bikes really at this point, charging for e-bikes.
No, so we amended our code, I think back in 2017 to allow e-bike usage through the city, but no, and honestly, I'm not familiar with kind of e-bike charging technology, if that's something that we need dedicated equipment for. And so, but no, right now the ordinance doesn't capture that. If that's something of technology or think we're missing and overlooking, let's look at that.
Okay. I won't continue for too long, but overall, I think this is sort of a sensible idea with the caveat that, it seems to me that all of this technology is changing really, really quickly, and we don't want to be locking people into technology that's going to be out of date, within a couple of years after they install it. And I think for that reason, I favor putting more into the EV ready, EV capable categories, rather than trying to pick winners and losers of charging technologies and that sort of thing to create some flexibility, recognizing that sometimes the code moves a little slower than the facts on the ground.
Thank you, Commissioner Hefner. Vice Chair Hefner, as it were.
Thank you.
I think I saw, Deborah, did you have your hand up earlier?
I did. So I was kind of going in that same realm, but so we're going by the percentages of the parking. And what happens when we have a development that has shared parking?
That's a great question. And so generally speaking, we say we have kind of a multi-tenant building at PUD, we would look at this collectively on the entire site. We do have some discretion in the language of the ordinance. I think, say, for example, maybe you're considering, say, the 511 East South Boulder, right, where they were providing very little parking on site, and they were utilizing, some of the adjacency to meet their parking requirement. I think in an instance like that, there is some discretion in the code that the planning director can determine kind of what is the right number if it's not clear within the tiers of uses, what that trigger should be. I don't know that we could. I think in a circumstance like that, we would probably be limited to requiring, maybe 100% on that site. I don't know that we could bind an adjacent property owner to make improvements on an adjacent property without their permission. So that's something that I would want to give a little thought to for any changes to the ordinance. And if you'd like to see that, we could bring it back, but that's my initial thought.
So when I was thinking about this, I was also thinking about the fact that the square footage of the development of the uses,
Mm-hmm.
and not necessarily or as well as the number of parking spaces. But I kept thinking about, the shared parking situation, because utilizing street parking and whatnot, and, parking from evening uses to morning and afternoon uses and stuff would make this very difficult to figure out what the percentage would be. So I'm wondering if there's a way, and I've seen that no one else is doing this, but tying it into how large the development is in each use.
So generally we do that for other areas. And so like I'm thinking, when we look at parking requirements for kind of a mixed use development, just to meet their minimum parking requirements, we do work with developers to kind of allocate, 30% of the building is going to be, warehouse use, and 20% is going to be office, and 20% is going to be retail, and whatever to get up to 100. And so I would imagine then my thought on that is we would do the same thing for the EV charging requirements, right? So when we do have a mixed use and development that has a mix of uses, we would kind of pro rata out everything to get to to match the mix of uses and kind of match the requirements. But if there's something that you think, over and above that, that would better capture kind of a mixed use environment, maybe a kind of a minimum number for a mixed use site, we could certainly discuss that as an option, but that's how staff would approach it given how the ordinance is drafted.
I'm just wondering if we need to codify that, because it seems that this is a, one size fits all.
Yeah.
And should we be in a weird situation for a different?
I think that's probably, I think that's actually probably a good clarification that I can work with city attorney on language before this goes to city council, just so that we do have a caveat in there that where a site has a mix of uses, how you arrive at that number. So I do think that's probably a good clarifier.
Okay, that was my only question.
Thank you, Commissioner Williams. Commissioner Deal, if you have questions, just, I see you're unmuted on your side, so chime in if you want to, because
Sure.
*9, I don't know if that'll work or not for you, but.
Yeah, no, that works great. So Lisa, in terms of the multifamily units, the 2 spaces, one ready, one capable, how does that work in, for example, let's just pretend the Dakota Ridge townhomes went forward kind of as conceptually designed.
Yep.
How would that rule work for that development?
Sure. So basically, if a multifamily property, whether it's 2 units or 10, if within that development there are designated parking spaces, so say with a garage, then that garage would be required, each of those units within that, within that development would be required to have, excuse me, one EV ready and one EV capable. So if there is designated parking for a multifamily unit, whether it's in a garage or a designated space, say through a carport, what have you, then we're at that kind of, 100% of the development gets one on day one. Where we didn't push that was on, say, an apartment building, or so say the Foundry project comes in with a multifamily project that doesn't have designated parking. So they have, say, maybe a surface parking lot. So I'm thinking maybe like the DLO apartments, right? They have a surface parking lot and those are not designated spaces. Then they would fall under that 10% threshold. So that basically only 10% of the tenants would have access to charging stations on day one, unless the property owner elected to install and further install more based on their tenant demand. And so one of the things I tried to do, and I could not find good data, was I wanted to try and find, particularly within Boulder County, but especially within Colorado, what is kind of our EV take-up rate? So where are we? How many EV vehicles do we have on the road now? And how much do we anticipate this to grow? And so, kind of the best number I could find fairly recently was the statewide of Colorado number, and we were hovering around 3.5% of all vehicles were, did have electric vehicle plug-in capability so that they could actually connect to this. So I think it's, from my perspective, it's very important that we're at least, matching that. And I think, kind of across the board, and I think we've bumped it higher than that. And I think, we probably can assume Boulder County's higher than that 3.5%, but I don't know, I wasn't able to find where we are today to understand kind of how we could match existing electric vehicle use.
Okay. And then I'm just curious in terms of applicants that we've worked with in the last year or 2 years. I guess what have been the conversations around how many EV spaces they wanted to put in that versus the city kind of pushed them to put in? Obviously, this is going to now codify and require it to be put in. But I guess what's the development community's perspective?
I would say the development community, because we don't have requirements, we encourage them, particularly our office users, because there are folks parking there from a long-term basis. A number of folks are installing these at building permit voluntarily, as building permits come in, folks out in the CTC are putting these in. The Medtronic application that actually did include some at the PUD level, not at the building permit level. But honestly, because staff there's no code associated with it, our ability to require it, so far, that's not an item that staff is pushing beyond an encouragement level, kind of initial, an initial application. Where they show interest, we work with them on what's the right location and how can we make sure we're, being thoughtful around it. We haven't engaged specifically the development community on this question, but we're certainly not the only community that already has this codified. And so I think where we might get some pushback from developers are probably kind of that tier 3 category. So, your retail users, but I would imagine a lot of our office tenants are doing this anyway. Multifamily, I think it makes a lot of sense and is an attraction for their tenant. So, obviously the flip side of this is cost, so particularly for when we think about affordable housing. So if you couple this on the affordable housing side, every time we're adding more, we're obviously adding more cost to these. So I think staff was also, particularly on the residential side, trying to balance affordability with energy efficiency goals.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. My particular reaction was to the requirements regarding the multifamily where there's non-designated parking spaces. And that struck me as fairly low. Okay. I'm curious what other commissioners think about that. Right, multifamily, of course, is always a challenge, and especially when we're trying to balance affordability with that. But even doing something like EV capable really is so much cheaper when construction is happening than adding it in later. So I'm just thinking that maybe that number could be higher, but curious as to other people's thoughts on that.
Did you want to start to engage in that now, Chair, or do we want to wrap up the staff?
Well, maybe Lisa, if you could kind of inform us of where that number came from, maybe that might be helpful.
Sure. I think it's kind of what I shared earlier. We just, so I'm going to go back to this slide. Again, we modeled our ordinance a little bit on the city of Lakewood. There's a number of communities in California. I mean, to your point, you're right. I did find a community that was as high as 50% on day one in California. So I think some communities are certainly pushing this much higher. I think when we look at the Colorado and kind of the Front Range Denver market, we would certainly be, kind of at the highest end for that day one. When you look at like Fort Collins and Lakewoods was down at 2%. Our initial draft, to be honest, was higher. I think I was at 15%, kind of at our initial draft. And then I backed it down a little bit just to make sure. I really wanted to check in with you all, just to see if we should push that higher. Because I think that was our initial thought, was go higher, and, just kind of backed off a little bit at the last minute, wanting to get direction from you all before we take this to council.
And then another question for you, Lisa, regarding in your research, did you find any requirements that on the commercial side that these have internet access, internet addressability?
That's a really good question. It's not something that I noticed in any of my research, but honestly, mine was more focused on minimum requirements. Katie Baum in our office, as well as, some code consultants that we rely on, focused more on the technical installation and electrical network and all of that. So that's something, in your experience, if you feel like is important, I can bring that back to the rest of our team and we can evaluate that.
It may or may not be important. There may be members of the public who will chime in on that too. We can find out, but it may be the type of thing too where that was important early on, and at this point they just rely on cellular technology, so that there's no actual requirements in the code for that. So,
Okay.
And then another question for you, section E.2.B,
Okay.
desirable and convenient parking locations.
It's pretty subjective. Is that what you're thinking?
Oh, yeah. And are you comfortable with that?
I think that's a great point, and I'd like to hear from you. I think from our perspective, we're fine leaving it somewhat flexible and setting that intent, through that with them. I think some of it depends on, building layout, site layout, access, topography, things like that to be reviewed at the PUD stage. So I'm comfortable with it, but I think if there are more kind of measurable standards like distance to the front entryway, or, that you want them kind of equally distributed throughout the site. I mean, I think that there are other ways that you could approach that. I think.
Yeah. So the only reference I have for that is initially LEED required essentially that they be adjacent to the ADA spaces.
Mhm.
So kind of the next closest in. And then after a while, there was an allowance for spaces that, particularly in areas where having a roof overhead was desirable, that those roofed areas could be considered desirable, even though they might be a little bit further out. And that would be both for snow and or for heat.
Right.
So it's just something for you all to consider as it moves forward, and whether you're comfortable with being able to interpret and enforce that. So
I think for the most, the majority of these will come through the PUD, for new development, and major redevelopments all require a PUD amendment. And so knowing that, I think through the review process, we do have the ability to kind of factor and evaluate that as well as Planning Commission and City Council will. It certainly is not a measurable standard though. So you're right. I mean, if an applicant doesn't concur or they really want to push it in another direction, we might have some challenges, but as you know, we do have a lot of subjective language in our code. So, but happy to entertain more specificity if there's areas you'd like to. You certainly have more experience with administering this and installing these than I do. So welcome all ideas.
Well, thank you. Are there any additional commissioner questions of staff? Commissioner Howe? You are still muted. There we go.
Sorry. Lisa, just a question about the residential uses, and it seems like we would be requiring EV ready and capable for the 240 volts. Is that correct?
Yep. Yeah. So, right. So again, not requiring them to actually have the equipment installed,
Right.
knowing that each car is a little different. Yes. One EV ready, so one 240 volt, and then capable means basically there's dedicated space with
Right.
conduit, as well as sufficient electrical capacity, but no actual outlet receptacle.
So I know that a lot of cars can be charged, and I don't. You guys may have considered this already. Just want to get some feedback from you. Have the capacity to be charged at 120 volts, which is not necessarily a dedicated line.
Yep.
So I guess I just don't want to throw up barriers to or incentives for residential owners to either have to install that or pay more for installation of that. What's the disadvantage to just saying, hey, a level 1 charger would be appropriate for residential use?
So my understanding of a level 1 charger, depending on your battery capacity, typically only charges maybe 3 to 5 miles an hour. And so, say if you have a battery range, say of, you have a high battery range, 250 miles, and your commute is 50 miles a day, you would really have a hard time getting replenished battery every morning, overnight charging. And so I think really the intent of providing that level 2 capacity at the home is basically you are fairly guaranteed that every morning you're going to wake up with a full charge.
Yeah, I guess in my experience, we're typically, I don't know if people are using that 280 or 350 mile range every day. And that's the assumption we're making, right? Is that they're going to be driving 300 miles, which is a lot of driving.
Sure. And so, most garages, our electrical code, our building code requires a 120 volt outlet in the garage. So that would basically be kind of no change other than we would require it for, say, an outdoor parking space, so if it's not in a garage, then we would actually put requirements in. Sure. So, I think that's something on the flip side too. If we feel like we're adding additional cost, to the construction of a home by requiring level 2 capacity. But honestly, I don't know that cost is significant at time of construction.
Yeah, I would agree. And also, right, the goal too is to make it such that as vehicles with longer range come online, that, well, it's one thing to have your daily commute be relatively short, but you want to go away for the weekend.
Yeah.
And then you want to charge overnight. So certainly that's the way the industry seems to be headed and would fit with the more typical American consumer, I think. So I would think that this is important for that aspect of it alone. So any other additional questions of staff at this time?
One other question, just in terms of the process, the requirements would be codified, but then the applicant obviously could get a waiver at the PUD stage if, for example, they wanted less spaces.
Yeah, so residential typically goes through a building permit, so they would need a variance, and then you're right, though, if an applicant is pushing back or they have a circumstance where, they don't feel like it's appropriate, that would go through a waiver.
So, and this is more for the commission, but, that almost lends itself to setting it at, kind of the highest level we're comfortable with, knowing that applicants can always request a lower number.
It's a fair point.
Very important point. Thank you, Commissioner Deal. All right. At this time, then I'd like to open it up to public comment. And Lisa, if you can check.
Yep.
There you go.
Mr. Harrington, you should be good to go.
Good evening, neighbors. RJ Harrington, 457 East Raintree Court here in Louisville.
Sorry, Mr. Harrington, if you can a little bit louder, maybe. I don't know if
Yes.
others are challenged.
Check 1, 2.
Yeah, that's better.
My mic and my headphone position. So full disclosure, we've been driving electric since 2013, predominantly solar powered electric here on site on our garage. And we now have 2 electric vehicles in the family fleet, looking to kick the Subaru to the curb as soon as we can and replace that with an EV. Even fuller disclosure, this is what I've been doing for a living for 6 years. And National Car Charging won the most recent RFP for the city of Louisville to do the car charger at the golf course. And we previously did the one at the rec center. So I know that we are not really set up to have me as a member of the public engage in a dialogue with you all. So I will mostly restrain myself to making some comments, particularly to what you've presented, Lisa, if you're okay with me calling you by your first name. I am RJ. So first of all, the Colorado Energy Office has a dashboard that shows EV registrations, and you can zoom down to the city level,
I will check that out. Thank
certainly
you.
the county level.
Mhm.
And there are 1 million vehicles in the state of Colorado electric vehicle plan for 2030. We are woefully far behind achieving what we need to on an annual basis, but suffice to say that our state's goals are significant, and that will certainly trickle down to our county level. And yes, you are already right. Our adoption rate in Boulder County is much higher than the state average of 3%. And I can't remember what it is because I haven't looked at that website in several weeks. At the tech center, from a workplace charging perspective, so we've done a number of projects there as well. Those are mostly onesie twosies. And I mean 1 dual port charging station at some fairly massive structures in parking lots that probably have the capacity for over 100 vehicles, in some cases twosies. When we are looking at the affordability and the multifamily perspective, I would suggest that perhaps we consider as a community saying, if you are doing a multifamily, but most importantly, affordable multifamily, that you take a specific look at car share, electric car share, of course, in this particular lens. And I will say that this is probably splitting hairs, but pardon me while I do a quick back to my own computer. So EV ready, if it in fact also includes the outlet, that's basically EV installed, because most of the vehicles being deployed on the market today come with a cord that will plug into either, to Keaton's point, a 120 volt outlet, household outlet, or now these days into a NEMA 1650, 200, 208 to 240 volt outlet. So that is a bit of hair splitting. I know that a lot of different communities and various code consultants that you referenced earlier have made these definitions, but from a professional standpoint, and to Dietrich's earlier comment, as technology evolves really rapidly, we need to be a little bit careful. I would also suggest from an, let me put this as politically correct as possible, from an anti-emissions biosphere destruction standpoint, we do need to take into consideration what the utility is doing. Their distribution grid is in a black box, but much of the time when we are planning projects, not only in monopoly utilities that have their distribution grid in a black box, but in co-op utilities and muni utilities, the distribution grid and what impacts additional loads will have is a very significant consideration. And that can be ameliorated if the broader code, sort of phase 1, phase 2 that you addressed earlier, and I'm aware of that phasing through my public involvement on the Louisville Sustainability Advisory Board. I am not a board member. That push will include on-site generation solar requirements. Perhaps we look at those solar requirements as integrated carports, integrated parking lot shading and solar combination. It's not going to be a direct generation, DC solar generation into an AC charger, which is what we're talking about here, level 2, but it will significantly offset the grid impacts. And then finally, also, Chair Bronice, you touched on BE2. You touched on it from a B perspective. So most of the folks that are doing this are considering those aspects. Where is it going to be safe for people to be able to charge? Is it well lit? Is it going to be snow free at winter time? Is it convenient? Is it roofed? Steve, you touched on that earlier, but even more broadly in BE2. So we have a statute, and I couldn't find it in advance of the meeting, but it does say that anybody providing electricity through an EV charging station, electric vehicle supply equipment is how it was codified all those years ago, can resell that electricity and not be regulated as a utility. So that opens up anybody that wants to collect that revenue for charging and do it on a very fair basis, which is by the kilowatt hour, as opposed to a time-based situation. But then even more broadly, BE2, there is a statute that I was able to find quickly, HB 19-1298. And what that focuses on is enforcement of charging stations. Even if an EV is parked at a charging station and not charging, a charging station owner operator has the option to call a peace officer and have that car be fined. So be it an EV that's not charging, be it an internal combustion engine vehicle that of course isn't charging, but is blocking a charging spot, that leads to an ICE vehicle occupying a charging station spot and how you choose where you're going to situate your charging station. You don't want it too far away from electrical, but you don't want it too close to the front door that any Tom, Dick, or Harry or Henrietta will park there. Chair Bronice, you touched on the connectivity aspect. These stations must be networked if they're going to be able to collect revenue. There's no thing as a coin operated charging station yet. Somebody will hack that pretty soon. The 40 amp circuit requirement, that's perfectly acceptable. But again, to Commissioner Hefner's comment, as technology evolves, it's already evolved past a 40 amp circuit. So those are the kinds of stations that have been deployed across the city, in the library, at the rec center, and the golf course that I referenced earlier. But that's 20 to 25 miles of range per hour. If somebody is doing a Tesla charger at home, they need a 100 amp circuit to provide charging at 208, 240 volt on an 80 amp output charging station. That's not just Tesla now. If you click on Amazon, all due respect to the Bezos, you will see all sorts of chargers on the marketplace today that range from a 30 amp output up to an 80 amp output at that level 2 charging speed. Oh, and then my final, I hope this is my final comment. Sorry. Oh, yes. When one does EV capable at construction, we know it's 5x less expensive than a retrofit. $125 per lineal foot retrofit, $25 per lineal foot new construction. And then really finally, City of Boulder has an energy code requirement for this, which is why you probably couldn't find it, because it's not in their building code, it's in their energy code. And their requirements are on the high end.
Okay.
So again, to Chair Hefner's, or not Chair, Vice Chair Hefner's earlier comment, we do want to be cognizant of the technology, and as it evolves, it's mostly software evolution, Commissioner Hefner. Hardware, it's evolving, sure, but it is limited at that 208, 240 volt impact that I already touched on as far as that amperage goes. So from an ordinance perspective, you might, I'm not sure how to write it. Do you want to say it's a minimum dual pole 40 amp circuit? Probably. Or do you say, do you codify that range? Must, max is basically 100 amp. So anything up to 100 amp, I don't know. And I could, of course, puke forever because I've been doing this for 6 years, but I'm going to stop there.
Oh, thank you very much, Mr. Harrington. We appreciate your knowledge and willingness to share it with us. With that, Lisa, can we check to see, are there any other members of public?
I see no other members of the public, and appreciate Mr. Harrington's tip. I did just locate the City of Boulder's EV charging station requirement, so I can just mention that real briefly for you for comparison and make sure that I update the information for City Council. But for residential units, basically they're requiring 1 on day 1 if a development has less than 25 spaces, and then once they get more than 25 spaces, they're requiring 5% on day 1, 40%, 5% on day 1, 10% at that kind of EV ready, and then 40% at that AV capable. So I think to Mr. Harrington's point, kind of that conduit stage, knowing that it's so much less expensive, they're kind of 40% at that point, but 5% on day 1. So a little less on that end and a little more on the other end. And I can continue to kind of look through here and see what I can find for commercial requirements. But for comparison, I appreciate the tip because he was right. I could not locate that during my research. So happy to answer any other questions though. And happy to also pull up that slide if you'd like with the percentages if you want to talk, if you're ready to talk through those.
I guess at this point, because the applicant is the city, we can kind of entertain some additional discussion amongst commissioners. And I don't want to close public hearing so that we can still come back and ask Lisa questions as we discuss it. So at this time, do any commissioners have thoughts, reactions, questions? And again, there I'm particularly interested in. So I do think we should make sure the language is minimum 40 amp.
Okay.
To allow for that better service potentially that
Okay.
some vehicles are able to take advantage of. And then also in particular regarding the multifamily. I think it's a challenge. Multifamily, I think far too often kind of gets left behind. And we don't want to kind of structurally create that within our code. So
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think as part of the broader Colorado energy roadmap, there's supposed to be at some point an electric vehicle equity plan. I don't know that it's out yet, but it strikes me that making sure we're affording the same sort of EV opportunities in the multifamily context to the extent we can is sort of an important equity consideration as well.
I would agree. And along those lines, does mirroring the Boulder, the city of Boulder requirement, which I think I heard would be 40% of all parking spaces in a multifamily, would that be something you would consider as fair or even higher?
Boy, I might go, I don't know. I might go higher just if we're saying, I mean, 2 spaces for a single family unit is 100%, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Correct.
Yep.
So if we're 100% for single family, I mean, it seems like 40 is still low. I guess that's combined. That's 55 now, or are you taking it down?
So yeah, so you can see what I'm doing right now is just adding in the Boulder requirements for comparison. So so that you can see the difference for our draft compared to the Boulder code. So just real quick for comparison. So I just noted that on the screen.
I like the 100%, but I think the counterpoint to that is the additional cost and trying to keep some of these multifamilies a little more affordable. Now, in the big scheme of these, you know, $25 per linear foot doesn't sound like we're adding tens of thousands of dollars per unit.
Yeah, I agree that it's a hard balance. I mean, I also come back to whether or not it happens. We've set out this goal as a state to hit 1 million EVs by 2030, and I think 100% EVs by 2050. You think about the service life of a parking lot at a multifamily unit getting built tomorrow, it's going to go at least through 2030 and might come somewhat close to 2050, but maybe not all the way there. So I don't know what the right.
I would be in favor of increasing this to 100% for multifamily unit. Do you want to make that a motion?
I like 100% for capable, but I would certainly be sympathetic to the argument that it's too much.
I think I'm right there with you, Commissioner Hefner. I like the sound of it. Does it make sense here in 2021? It's hard to know, right? We don't have that crystal ball, so.
Well, we always have the off-ramp of the PUD waiver.
That's true. That's very true.
And capable is just saying, we're not even saying you have to put in the circuit. We're not saying you have to do anything other than run conduit.
Conduit and electrical capacity in this panel and switchboard,
Okay.
but no
wires.
Right.
Right.
So it could put you know, a more expensive panel
Yeah.
requirement into the development.
Well, and service ultimately at that point, when you're talking, you know, 40, 50, 100 spaces to service, but and that is the goal though, is that that you have room in a utility closet to be able to install that. So while it's while there are some very real expenses involved, it is infinitely cheaper during construction than later. So 50%, 75%, 100%.
Well, I
Anybody
think
else?
I would just say maybe something else. I think we have to remember what RJ mentioned, that we have to also recognize the stress that this would put on the utility companies or those providing electricity. So if you're gonna have a multifamily and you're gonna require 100% capable, but you have to provide that amount of electricity, if I'm not mistaken. I don't know where our electric grid stands. I don't know if that's important to know before we would make that commitment. I mean, could it be that these new multifamilies provide all that electricity, and then we're much closer to blackouts and things like that?
I would say that's a problem for another group and for the electric utilities primarily, and they all know this is coming. They know EVs are coming in huge numbers. It's being talked about all over the place.
Yeah, I agree with you, Commissioner Hefner, on that one. That it's in their plans. And it's also their job to figure it out. So,
Although I think you're right that it will be a difficult problem for someone.
I think we hope that they are figuring it out. Maybe we leave it at that.
Sure.
Mhm.
So I'm sensing that a number of us feel the number should be higher, at least for EV capable for multifamily without dedicated parking spaces. Lisa, is there a challenge in splitting this tier one between the multifamily and the hotel motel?
No, absolutely not. I mean, I think, no, definitely not. We can certainly break this out and kind of heat hotel motel, either, put it down in with tier two if you don't think the demand's going to be that high. I think we felt like yes, however you want to approach that. Absolutely. We could do, however you want to do it.
But I am also left to wonder for hotel motel and thinking of Louisville and what might happen in the next 20, 30 years. Not kind of precisely knowing how charging is going to end up working, though, that if you are on the road in an EV, you're going to need to charge. So if you're spending the night somewhere, that kind of indicates you've driven a while, likely, and that you will need capacity charge. So I don't know what do other people think about that, whether it's a separate kind of animal or whether we should keep them lumped together.
Boy, I was gonna originally say separate them out, but I think you make a fair point about people on the road, and are they really in that different of a situation? In fact, they may be in a situation where, assuming EVs are sort of distributed equally, they need the charging more.
Well, with the current requirements, we have basically 35% for a new hotel development would be at a minimum EV capable. So you're saying you're considering a higher number than 35%?
Right.
I wonder, I'll just throw this idea out there. Is there a way to have sort of a goal number for this category of 100%, that, boy, we'd really like to see you try 100%, and maybe we'll give you some other waiver that you ask for if you meet, or we'll view it positively if you hit 100%, but we're really only going to require 40.
Where that would fall under is if we consider some sort of a green building ordinance, really, where you have kind of a menu of choices perhaps, or something like that. I think code itself tries to steer away from aspirational. I don't know, Lisa, if you have additional thoughts on that. But.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I think generally aspirational is hard to require. It's usually, kind of the menu of options, or if we rewrote our waiver criteria, which has been on our list for a long time, to expand it, just, right now it's like you provide open space. So, all these other things you could use to meet a waiver criteria. It could be something, if you don't want to push it yet at this stage, certainly knowing and hearing from you, though, from a staff perspective, if we hear from applicants that, from a policy perspective, this helps support waivers, we have to try and think of what that right nexus is, so we could certainly work with applicants that way. If we can think of a nexus for a rationale for a waiver for something else that is offset and helps be met by this. So, yeah, I think aspirational is tricky. But it certainly can be in the intent language of the ordinance, so we could put that in there.
I guess from my perspective too, going from basically 0 required today to anywhere from 20 to 25 to 35% required, once this is codified, is a pretty significant jump in terms of requirement. As the EVs continue to evolve, as everybody on the commission either has or purchases their first EV, and the rest of the town does likewise, obviously we can revisit this.
Well, I'll go ahead and throw out for tier 1, 5, 10, 50.
Is that just hotel motel?
For multifamily. And I don't think we've
Tier 1
decided
as
whether,
defined.
yeah.
Yep.
So to confirm,
if you want-
you'd require less on day 1, but ultimate build out could get to more.
Yeah, sort of recognizing that the changing technology and changing needs, and that there not that many folks are using EVs right now, but we expect it to go way up.
Huh. Interesting.
Say the
I
numbers
agree
again,
with that
Lisa?
too. I think that for the multifamily, I think we should have a high percentage capable, meaning that all the conduits are in. I'm wondering how it looks for the hotel motel. If it's capable, there's not going to be any incentive for them to actually put it in. They can put all the conduit in, but there's a higher cost to actually install it or have it ready. It would have to be installed for the hotel motel. So I would lean towards a higher installation. I think it's less likely that the hotel motel will actually then install an EV capable.
I guess I sort of think of it as a something of a chicken and egg problem, that the thing we're trying to solve here is getting the capacity there so that when the increased EV penetration comes along, the hotel is ready to go and can put in the charging stations to meet the demands that they now have from their customers who are all driving EVs. And if they don't put it in now while they're building, it may be cost prohibitive to retrofit.
Yeah, no, I think there is a market driver where the hotels are a little bit more closely linked to the market. But so for the hotel, then are you suggesting maybe like a 10-10-40 or 10-10?
What were your numbers again, Dietrich?
I was saying 5, 10, 50, just mainly because I like the sound of it, but I think it's the sort of rough level that for each category, it seems about right to me. And recognizing basically by saying we're only going to do 5 on day 1, the sort of counterbalance to that is it's going to be 50 capable.
And you're proposing that would apply to both multifamily and hotel motel?
Yeah, although I don't feel strongly about that.
About which one, the hotel motel?
Yeah, I mean, I can see an argument for doing hotel motel a little differently than multifamily. I think the main thing for me is I imagine, and maybe this is wrong, but I sort of imagine most people are going to charge their EVs at night while they're sleeping at home. And if we're saying for detached single family or condos that have garages, we're going to do a 100% requirement, I think we should try and go as high as we're comfortable on multifamily that has a parking lot, because why should those people have less access to EV charging than somebody in a detached single family home?
100% agree with that.
And to be
I don't
fair,
have a problem.
50% is less, but I think that seems like maybe as high as we're willing to go.
And I'm fine with the same percentages for hotel motel as well. If you want to make a motion, I'll make a second.
Well, before we do that, how about a 10-10-50?
Sure.
Agree with that as well.
I don't think we need to back off hugely on the installed. So is everybody comfortable with the 10-10-50 maybe?
I think that's
I
better.
would be.
All right.
I don't want to go.
So
lower.
before we get ahead of ourselves, I will then go ahead and close public comment period. Offer the applicant a response and closing statement.
Sure. So I'm just going to highlight kind of where you all landed. I just want to make sure that if you don't have comments on kind of the tier 2, tier 3, oh, that didn't work. That's great. Or if you just want to make sure we're not ignoring tier 2 and tier 3, if you think we're getting those numbers right. I think to Commissioner Hefner's point, that is kind of what we were thinking over the long term is, the residential uses, most people would probably be charging at night. And so I think even long term, staff doesn't feel as strongly that ultimate number needs to be as high for some of those uses. But certainly, I mean, that was where we were coming from. But if you all disagree based on experience or what you're thinking, how this is going to be utilized in the future, let's talk about those numbers too. So just make sure we're not forgetting them, that's all.
I'm comfortable with those numbers for tier 2 and tier 3 where they're currently proposed. I don't know, but I'm welcome to any suggestions if people feel otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, for tier 2 and tier 3, if I just take the argument that, the principle is we're future proofing in these developments and it's cheaper to just get it done at build. So isn't there an argument knowing that by 2030, we're going to have 1 million, by 2050, it's going to be 100%. Isn't there an argument that says tier 2 and tier 3 should be as high as, 40 to 50% as well for net new developments that again are intended to be future proofed?
One of the dynamics we haven't touched on is that typically the cheapest place to charge your car would be at home. And that when you are purchasing from somebody who's essentially reselling, that there are additional fees involved there. And that typically EV owners are going to want to avoid that unless they're in a situation where that could be part of their employment package or with some kind of a perk or something where they're able to charge for free. But that's up to the market, I think. So in this case, I don't know. What do other people think as far as these numbers? I'm certainly sympathetic to that thought that tier 2 and tier 3, but I don't know that we always have to have it at both ends of our commute.
I have a couple thoughts on tiers 2 and 3. The first is, it seems to me that technology-wise, most EVs are now at a point where you're within range of your job to get there and back pretty comfortably and charge at home. So I think that's one argument for keeping these numbers relatively lower. I think that the second point, though, and maybe the more important point, is you also hear an awful lot about autonomous vehicles, and fearful as I am of that future, I mean, it's possible your car is going to drop you off at work and go charge somewhere else during the day. I don't know. I'm not enough of a technologist to speak to that, but it seems to me that being a little more conservative at businesses makes some sense.
I buy all those points. I think those are very good points, gentlemen. So I'd be happy with keeping tier 2 and tier 3 where they are.
Yeah, I would be too.
All right. I'm guessing then we have no additional questions of staff. So I will now close the public hearing, and the planning commissioners have already deliberated on the evidence presented. No further public comment or other testimony or evidence will be received. Do we have any additional thoughts, questions, or are we ready for a motion?
I think we're ready.
All right, I'm ready.
Vice Chair, Your Honor.
You're inviting me to make a motion. I don't know how to put it exactly. And I also don't
A
have
motion to approve a request for approval of a draft ordinance amending Title 17 of the Louisville Municipal Code concerning new requirements for electrical vehicle charging infrastructure, resolution number 13, series 2021.
And I suppose, would you entertain a friendly amendment to include the modifications to the percentages we talked about this evening?
Yes, please. And did we leave that at what was our final numbers?
10, 10, 50, I believe.
10, 10, 50, yep.
Yeah, so you'd be amending the ordinance to revise the tier 1 requirements to 10%, 10%, and 50% for EV capable.
Correct. Yes. All right.
I will second.
Thank you for this second. With that, then a roll call vote, please.
Commissioner Hefner,
Yes.
Commissioner Williams,
Yes.
Commissioner Howe,
Yes.
Commissioner Deal,
Yes.
Chair Browning.
Yes, the motion carries. I think we will all be interested to see where it continues. Thank you so much I know that was a lot of research, Lisa, that kind of came up quickly in your windshield. At that point, then we do move into Planning Commission comments. I'd like to celebrate the interim director of Planning and Building Safety,
Thanks.
Ms. Ritchie. It really does speak well to how deep our bench and your knowledge and capabilities are, and really fortunate that we have you to be able to step into place at this point in time. So thank you very much.
Here.
Here.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I'm on ending week 2 here, and so far, hopefully, nothing is breaking down within the city. So, yeah, no, but I do think, and I think from my perspective, it just speaks to Rob's leadership in that, you know, our department was kind of selected as the backup team to step forward. So I was happy to be part of that and give him all the credit for the decisions he's made over the last few years. So yeah, but thank you. I appreciate that.
Certainly, nicely done, and we wish you well in this role as it continues. Do we have any staff comments?
Yeah, so I just wanted to provide a quick update on the Old Town zoning update. So greatly appreciate those of you who are able to participate during the stakeholder interviews. If you still want to participate, reach out to me. We could schedule a quick call next week with a consultant team. I know Commissioner Howe, I think I messed up your Zoom invite. I'm not sure exactly what happened there. And I know Chair Brown, you weren't able to participate. So if the two of you are interested, please let me know and I can see what we can do there. As far as next steps go, over the next month, the consultant team is going to be compiling all the feedback that they heard from the public as well as from all the stakeholders, and hopes to present that to Planning Commission and HPC and City Council in October and November. So what I wanted to mention to you, and I'll reach out to Commissioner Moline, is in the interest of efficiency as well as collaboration, staff was hoping to invite Planning Commission to the next regularly scheduled HPC meeting, Historic Preservation Commission meeting in October. So that would be October 18th. That's a Monday night. They meet on the third Monday so that we could hold a joint meeting during their regular meeting for the consultant team and staff to present the findings and draft diagnostic report for the Old Town overlay. So if any of you know now that you're not available, please let me know. Or if any of you do not like that approach, also now would be the time to let me know that. And I can also reach out separately over email if you're not sure on your schedules. So just an update on that. So interested in your thoughts.
Sounds great. Maybe we can double check if you can trigger an email to cause us all to check our calendars, that'd be much appreciated.
You got it. So look for an email from Amelia in the next couple days, just to confirm attendance, but we'll plan on that then as an approach, unless I hear objections to that approach for a joint meeting.
At least on our interview with the
Yeah.
consultants, I had mentioned a developer's name, Mark Bush,
Okay.
who has basically developed at least 4 or 5 residential homes right down the street from LES. I can't remember the name of that street. And he was
Okay.
willing to talk to the consultants, and I kind of forwarded.
I saw that email from
address.
you. I'll reach out to the consultant team again and let them know that, just remind them that they're interested or available.
Yeah, I think some feedback from some folks who've lived it and breathed it is probably
Mhm.
going to be valuable. So
Absolutely. No, thank you for that. We do have a
Yeah.
technical advisory team, but he was not a person I was aware of. And so we can certainly get more input there.
very good.
All right. Any other questions on that? Okay.
Count me in
Um,
for that. Sorry, I wasn't able to partake in the discussion previously, but yeah, I'd be happy to discuss with them.
Okay, great. Yeah, Commissioner Howe and then Chair Branice, I'll reach out to you offline over email and see if we can try and get a quick meeting scheduled next
Great.
week to get you all in the loop on that. So thank you for
Make
that.
sure to study all the houses in Old Town before you go in.
It is helpful if you have been in the neighborhood recently, because they do want to know.
You gotta keep all those street names correct.
All right, additional
Oh,
staff comments?
Sorry, Commissioner Williams, I apologize. If you want to try and reschedule as well, please let me know. I know we missed that one too at the last minute, so my apologies for getting that. So yeah, if you're interested, we could try and do that. Staff has no other comments or no other, nothing else further. As far as the agenda for October, it is looking like we potentially have 3 applications that will be ready. I don't know that any of them are on their own overly complicated, but we may have a full agenda and we'll see. We'll do our best to get through it in one meeting, and if not, we'll talk how to get through it.
All right, fantastic. With that then, I would entertain a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
All
Second.
in favor? I'll second it. All in favor? Aye.
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 Thank you all.
Thank everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And again, always
Bye,
appreciate your
everyone.
thoughtful discussions.